We have the tech to get food delivered in 15 minutes, but we all have horror stories about buying tickets. The Game Time app gives fans the advantage. Get amazing tickets in just a few taps. Fees are included, so what you see is what you pay. And the Game Time guarantee means authentic tickets at the best price every time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets to concerts, sports, comedy, and more with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We are living in very unusual times. The pandemic recovery is pretty much over, and economies around the world were starting to see a rebound in growth until the war in Iran started at the end of February. Now, Canada is not technically in a recession, but for some, things don't feel good. Higher oil prices also squeezing many consumers, but not all. Experts who track such things say we are in a K-shaped economy. So what is it? How did it happen? And why does it matter? Also, how could Tuesday's inflation update further exacerbate the situation? I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of In This Economy, we speak to Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work based in Vancouver. Thank you so much, Jim, for agreeing to do this today.
My pleasure to join you, Kris. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with the very obvious first question. What is a K-shaped economy?
This term K-shaped economy obviously comes from the letter K. And if you look at it, it is the first letter of your first name, Kris. So I guess you're familiar with what a K looks like.
But it has nothing to do with me.
It has two lines going in opposite directions, one going up and one going down. And that is the idea behind this concept of a K-shaped economy, where you're seeing one part of the economy doing very well, their incomes rising, their wealth rising, their prosperity rising, and much of the rest of the economy, clearly the majority of the economy, not doing so well. Their income's not keeping up with prices, their affordability challenges getting worse, their wealth depleting or disappearing. And we have seen over the last several years this phenomena in many countries around the world. Especially in the United States. This is where the concept really originated, where you see a very small elite that has never had so much wealth, amassed more wealth than has ever been concentrated in a small group of people in human history, really, but the rest of the society struggling. In Canada, it's also relevant, although, to be frank, less extreme. We've got a stronger set of programs in Canada to share the wealth. Not enough, in my view, and you are seeing growing inequality from that line at the top of the K going up and the line at the bottom of the K going down.
Now, the line at the top of the K, are we talking like 1% here? Is it like the uber rich that are in that sort of part of the letter?
Funny you should mention Uber, because of course the rich people who run Uber and started it are part of that upper K for sure. Whereas the drivers on Uber, who aren't even guaranteed a minimum wage for their work, are definitely in the bottom part of the K. It's hard. There's different studies that have isolated different groups to make that comparison. And it's sometimes limited by what we have statistics on. So Statistics Canada, for example, publishes regular reports every year on household wealth. And they only break it down by quintiles, by 20% groups. So when you see a number saying Statistics Canada shows wealth inequality is widening, and that is indeed what it shows, but they're measuring the top 20% versus the rest of the society. In a way, that's not a great way to get at it, because the concentrated wealth really is at a smaller group at the top. The top 1% to 2% of Canadians who, realistically are millionaires in terms of how much financial wealth they have. And even smaller groups than that, the 0.01% at the top, who are the folks with many millions of dollars. And of course, in Canada, we have 100 or so billionaires. So those are very small segments of society. And they are clearly the ones who've captured the lion's share of the wealth that you see flowing around on stock markets hitting record highs, or CEO salaries hitting record highs, or special cash dividends and share buybacks from very profitable corporations. That's where that money is ending up, in a relatively small group at the top.
throughout history, it's come up before. This is not a new phenomenon, but why is it happening now?
I think there's a number of factors there. One is how we have changed or maybe not modernized enough the rules of the game in the overall economy. So, in the 60s and 70s, it was not a K-shaped economy. It was the opposite. And that was a time when we were kind of taking proactive efforts as society. And this was true in most of the rest of the world, even in America in the 60s. To try and share the wealth actively and deliberately. So, we had high progressive taxes that captured a share of the wealth that was captured at the top end and then use it to fund social programs and income transfers that shared the wealth through society. We had a strong labor market, relatively low unemployment, rising wages. You had trade unions that were growing rather than being kind of on the back foot or defensive, as is more often the case today. And all of those things contributed to a narrowing of the income gaps. More recently, we've seen a shift in many of those policies. And so it's always, there's always a pseudo-economic rationale for it. So income taxes for high income earners have been reduced significantly below what they were in the 60s and 70s. Income taxes on corporations have been reduced dramatically since the post-war era. You've had the development of various kind of financial or wealth management strategies to avoid taxes. Just think about family trusts, for example, or the use of capital gains as a way of evading normal income taxes that the rest of us pay. That has reinforced the concentration of wealth among those who are already rich. Most recently, Kris, this tech boom that you're seeing is absolutely unprecedented. So you've got a handful of incredibly profitable companies, the Magnificent Seven, as they're sometimes called on the stock market, companies like Meta and Nvidia, Tesla. Seven companies control about 40% of the stock market wealth in the U.S. economy. This is just unprecedented. You think back even to the robber baron days of in the 19th century, it wasn't this concentrated, or the Standard Oil days of the early 20th century, not this concentrated. Seven companies, all owned and controlled by mega billionaires, really being the dominant source of wealth creation and economic growth in the world's biggest economy. And again, in Canada, it's not that bad, but we're getting spillover effects from it, both because Canadian wealth owners have invested in that U.S. tech boom, but also because we face pressures from tech investors and tech owners in Canada to copy U.S. policies, saying if we don't cut our taxes and if we don't get government out of the way and if we don't allow these companies more freedom in the economy, we'll fall behind the Americans. And that's putting pressure on our own kind of a social compact, if you like. So I think since the COVID pandemic, and the disruptions that people felt, the challenges in affordability, contrasting with this unprecedented explosion of stock market wealth and concentration, that seems to be the key driver of the K-shape these days.
And I think maybe one of the ways that is illustrated is the fact that oil prices are as high as they are now because of the war in the Middle East. If you're a rich person or a millionaire or a billionaire for that matter, a higher gas prices, not really a big deal. For people in the, lower part of the K, that can be a difference between, driving your car or putting groceries on the table.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned this, Kris, because I do think this K-shaped phenomenon is going to get a big boost because of this latest oil price shock. So it's partly because, as you point out, the cost of energy, the cost of gas and diesel and fuel oil is proportionately larger and more important in the budgets of lower income people. There's no doubt about that. So they get the hit from high oil prices. But there's another side of the coin, which is who gets the benefit from high oil prices. So the windfall, of course, is going to the petroleum industry around the world. Their actual costs of production, unless you're in the Persian Gulf area itself, in which case it's been a catastrophe. But for oil producers anywhere else, including in Canada, This is like winning the lottery. Your cost of production hasn't changed, but the price that you're selling your product for has almost doubled. And depending on how long the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, the windfall is going to be enormous. We've done some research through our center, and we think that even if the strait opened tomorrow, the oil industry in Canada would get about $65 billion in additional revenue over a 12-month period since the conflict started. And their profits are going to be higher than ever. It's actually very similar to what happened a few years ago in 2022. We had an oil price shock after the Russians invaded Ukraine. And that one, in a way, was almost unjustified because world oil supply wasn't really affected that time. It was more about concerns about geopolitical stability and all that drove up the oil price. This time, world oil supply is affected. 20% of it's been shut because of the conflict and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I expect this oil price shock will go higher and last longer than the 2022 crisis did. But it is clearly going to divert wealth from people who pay the cost of those higher oil prices and everything that's made from oil, obviously including fuel, but indirectly pretty well everything else, right? Everything from transportation, airfares, food, delivery charges, all kinds of things are going to go up in cost because of high oil prices. The benefits of that are going to flow to the petroleum industry, which is, like most industries, owned disproportionately by the small segment of society that has most of the wealth. There was a very interesting study, Kris, done after the 2022 oil price shock to trace through where did the money go from that. And it turned out, not really surprisingly, using U.S. data, 50% of the profits and dividends and capital gains to the oil industry from that price shock went to the richest 1% of society. And for the bottom 50% of society, they only got about 1%, through their little mutual fund holdings or whatever other investments they had, 1% of the benefits, but they paid most of the costs because of higher energy prices. So it had a huge disequilibrating effect on income distribution, and it had a huge disruptive effect on mentality and culture and politics. This is where we're getting some of these very extreme ideas and ideologies from people who just feel absolutely infuriated that they work hard, but their living standards going backwards, while this top part of the K goes higher and higher.
Well, and as you outlined there, it's sort of a double-edged sword for Canada because the higher oil prices are good for the economy, but bad for the Canadian consumer.
Yeah, I often cringe when I hear some folks say, well, Canada is a net oil exporter, which we are. We produce 3 times more oil than we use. Therefore, high oil prices, good for Canada. And I think that judgment is just so wrong. It assumes that Canada is like a big, happy family, that just takes in money from all sources, puts it in the middle of the kitchen table, and then shares it. And guess what? That isn't how it works. Yes, there are winners in Canada, primarily the people who own oil companies. That doesn't mean people who live in Alberta, for example. It's often assumed that Alberta is a winner, but the vast majority of people in Alberta don't own an oil company. They work for the oil industry, but they don't own anything, and they're not going to capture those profits. They might not even get more jobs from it. The evidence seems to be that the oil industry is just harvesting these profits. They're not really reinvesting them. But what you do in Alberta, like the rest of Canada, is you're paying 60 cents more a liter now for gasoline than you did in February. So there are winners. Now, the governments, particularly Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, where they collect royalties on the oil because the oil is owned by the people and then it's sold to the oil companies, so they have to pay something for it. They are paying a royalty. They will get a fiscal gain, and that will help the budgets in those 3 provinces. The rest of the provinces, it's a straight negative on fiscal impact. The federal government will collect a little bit more money in income taxes on those oil companies. Their profits are going to go up a lot, but I think that will be outweighed by the costs that the federal government will face because of high inflation, high energy prices, and soon high interest rates. So on a net basis, it's a loss for the federal government and most of the country. The main winners will be the oil industry. So in that regard, I don't think we can conclude this is good for the whole economy, even though Canada is a net oil exporter.
We have the tech to get food delivered in 15 minutes, but we all have horror stories about buying tickets. The Game Time app gives fans the advantage. Get amazing tickets in just a few taps. Fees are included, so what you see is what you pay. And the Game Time guarantee means authentic tickets at the best price every time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets to concerts, sports, comedy, and more with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
You mentioned the word inflation, and the higher oil prices adds to inflation, which adds potential to interest rate hikes. That's not going to help solve this K-shaped economy situation either.
I got one word reaction to your question. Ouch.
Yeah.
And it is going to hurt. So next week on Tuesday, we'll get the Statistics Canada inflation reading for April. We've already seen inflation jump from 1.8% in February to 2.4% in March. I expect that April number will be 3% or higher. In the U.S., they just released their April inflation number. They're a few days ahead of us, and it was 3.8%. Ouch. Then we're getting additional readings on inflation. For example, there's another measure of inflation called the Producer Price Index rather than the Consumer Price Index. The Producer Price Index measures the cost of raw materials and inputs used by businesses, or the wholesale price of things that businesses produce. It rose 6% in America year over year to April. So it is coming. And obviously, you see the impact, the direct impact, every gas station you drive by. That's very visible price. But the indirect impacts are going to be even worse because all of these other industries that use oil are in the process now of increasing their own prices to make up for the fact that they have to pay more for the oil they use. So this is why airfares are going up, for example, or delivery charges for everything that you get. We're going to see food prices increase for that very reason. So that means I would expect inflation to rise definitely above 4% in Canada in coming months, and potentially higher depending on how long the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. The Bank of Canada is watching this like a hawk. Now, they have said they aren't going to overreact just to the oil price shock itself, and this is sensible. You know, the energy prices and some other volatile prices go up and down all the time, and you can't have the Bank of Canada jacking up or cutting interest rates, you know, on sort of a month-by-month basis. But they have confirmed, as soon as they see that oil price shock spreading through other goods and services prices in the economy, they are going to move, and they're going to move quickly. So we are getting ready to see another tightening cycle in interest rates. The last time this happened in 2022, with the oil price shock after the invasion of Ukraine, the Bank of Canada increased interest rates 10 times. Now, it's not going to be that bad this time, mostly because interest rates are much higher than they were at the start in 2022. But we are going to see interest rate increases over the next year. There's no doubt about it. So again, if you're on the bottom side of the K and you pay more in interest on your mortgage and your credit cards than you make on the stock market and the bond market, then this is going to make things worse. If you're on the top part of the K, then you've got a lot of money in the bank, and high interest rates can actually be a benefit for you. So once again, both the oil price shock itself and then the policy response to it is going to send those two lines on the K even further in opposite directions.
And I don't mean to pile on, but there's one other uncertainty that we haven't discussed yet, and that's the idea of the review of CUSMA. How does trade with the U.S. play into this? Like, if there are higher oil prices and higher gas prices, anything imported from the U.S., it just piles on. All of a sudden, that orange from Florida is now costing $5.
Yeah, well, certainly the uncertainty related to our trade relationship with the United States and Mr. Trump's, very erratic and aggressive actions on the tariff front meant, we were already kind of in trouble even before the war started in the Persian Gulf. We've seen significant damage done particularly in those industries that were targeted by Mr. Trump's sectoral tariffs, they're called. So this is the steel industry, the auto industry, aluminum, forestry, and he's looking at more sectoral tariffs targeted at other industries that are important in Canada, like aerospace, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery. So this was already a big problem for us. The government, of course, federally has been trying to diversify Canada's trade relationships to help us export more to other countries rather than the U.S. and sidestep the tariffs. Also to accelerate projects within Canada of all sorts. So this was already there. How will this be affected by the oil price shock? We export a lot of petroleum to the United States. That's where most of our petroleum goes. So, from a trade balance perspective, this is going to make our trade balance look better. And we've already seen that in the initial data. But again, you and I, Kris, aren't paid out of the national trade balance. So the number might look good, but it doesn't really affect us. And it doesn't offset the fact that we're paying so much more at the gas pumps ourselves. We do import from the United States as well, particularly refined petroleum products, particularly in Eastern Canada. This has always been a bugbear for me. Canada is a big exporter of oil, but we actually import gasoline. That doesn't make sense. We should have had more infrastructure and more refining capability in Canada so we could be using our own energy. So the impacts, I think, will be complicated. For Mr. Trump, the trade war was always about domestic politics and domestic optics more than anything else. There's no economic rationale for what he's doing. It's all about, trying to position himself as America first, and I'm going to defend Americans, even though his tariffs are clearly hurting Americans. The fact that the Iran war is so unpopular at home and has gone so badly, both, militarily, but also economically, undermines Mr. Trump's position considerably. And so as we enter these months of negotiations over CUSMA, if anything, I think Canada's bargaining position is stronger just because Mr. Trump is in trouble. And I think that increases the chance that he'll try to cut some symbolic deal, make it look like he's a winner. That's what he always wants to do. But we'll end up with a trade deal that looks more or less like the trade deal we had when he came into office the second time. That would be a good outcome. But we're going to have some rocking and rolling before then. Because how Mr. Trump rolls, he likes to make big threats and deliver ultimatums, and then at the end of the day, he usually chickens out.
Given all of this, sort of as the landscape that we're dealing with right now, is there a way to solve the K-shaped economy and make it less so? Do you see any way to smooth things out or create more balance within Canada?
Oh, certainly, Kris. It's not at all inevitable that those two lines have to go in different directions like that. That hasn't always been true in Canadian history, and it's not true in every country around the world. There are other countries that do a much better job of ensuring that the gains of economic growth are shared by the bottom part of the K, not just concentrated at the top. A whole range of things. Maybe two broad categories. One is what I call pre-distribution, and the other is redistribution. Pre-distribution is maybe not as familiar to people, but this is where we kind of tweak the rules of the economy so that even before the government comes in with taxes and programs and that kind of thing, you're getting fairer and more even outcomes. So think about things like, say, competition law to prevent companies in these very concentrated sectors, like the tech companies we mentioned, from making so much profit in the first place. Think about things like labor laws to try and promote the ability of everyone from traditional industrial workers to Uber drivers. Give them some power so that they can negotiate better wages in the first place through higher minimum wages, stronger labor laws, stronger trade unions, etc. These are ways that you can prevent the K shape from appearing in the first place. Then there's the redistribution part, which is what does government do given how the market is working to try and make sure that the final distribution of income is a bit fair. And this is where the tax and transfer and public programs part comes in. We could make our taxes a lot fairer. There's all kinds of loopholes that wealthy people enjoy to reduce their ultimate tax burden. The capital gains exemption is a huge one. If you earn your income by flipping stocks on the stock market or derivatives or crypto or oil futures these days, that income is considered a capital gain, and you only have to claim half of it on your income tax. Go figure. Whereas if you flip burgers at McDonald's, you have to claim all your income on your income tax. That's just blatantly unfair. And there's all kinds of economic hocus pocus that's used to justify this about, appealing to investors and so on. It's all self-serving. Interestingly enough, we actually tried to fix that a bit a couple of years ago when Krista Freeland was the finance minister. She brought in a reform to the capital gains system where you'd go from 50% inclusion to 66% inclusion. That's still a lot better than the 100% inclusion that the McDonald's worker faces. But that alone was so offensive to the rich and powerful in the land that they had a giant campaign and they defeated it. The government withdrew it. So that shows you in a way how hard it is to take on this redistribution task, but there's lots of ways we can do it. Fairer taxes on those at the top, more generous transfers and income supports for those at the bottom. And, to be fair, we've done some of that. The Canada Child Benefit has had a huge impact in reducing poverty among families with young children. It's an enormous and I think underreported success story. The expanded GST credit, the government's renamed it. It's now called the Groceries and Essentials Credit. Gives back some of the GST that people at the low end pay. These are important measures that can help bring the two lines of the K together. But ultimately, Kris, I think it's a political question, not an economic question. Can the majority of society who are in the bottom half of that K, the bottom line of the K, not the bottom half, the bottom line, can they muster enough kind of focused pressure to say, look, we're working hard to build this economy and too much of the fruits of our labor are showing up on the top line, which I have no hope of ever reaching. So let's build a society that's, actively trying to share the wealth rather than celebrating its concentration in so few hands on the top part of the K.
Well, hopefully the government's listening. Thank you so much for doing this today. Your expertise is very much appreciated in breaking down some of these issues.
My pleasure, Kris. Thank you for having me.
Jim Stanford is economist and director at the Center for Future Work. For more of Jim's work, you can log on to centerforfuturework.ca. Now, other episodes of In This Economy can be found on the Seeker app. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.